they asked me to announce the Zaytuna website, which is very simple, zaytuna.org. So Imam Zaid Shakir is among the most respected and influential Muslim scholars in the West. He was born in Berkeley, California, the second of 7 children, and he formally accepted Islam in 1977 while serving in the United States Air Force. He obtained a BA with honors in international relations at American University in Washington, D.C., and later earned his MA in political science at Rutgers University. And he helped revive the MSA there, co-leading a successful South Africa divestment campaign and co-founding the local Islamic center, Masjid al-Huda. After a year in Cairo, Egypt, studying Arabic, he settled in New Haven, Connecticut, and he co-founded the Masjid al-Islam, which you heard before. And in 1988 to 94, he spearheaded a community revival and grassroots anti-drug effort in the local neighborhood and taught as adjunct professor of political science and Arabic at Southern Connecticut State University until his departure to Syria. For 7 years in Syria and briefly in Morocco, he immersed himself in the study of Arabic, Islamic law, Quranic studies, and Islamic spirituality. In 2003, he moved to Hayward, California, with his family to serve as scholar in residence and lecturer at the Zaytuna Institute, where he now teaches regular courses on Arabic, Islamic law, history, and spirituality. So without further ado, Imam Zaid.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace and prosperity. I'd like to first of all thank all of you for coming, and hopefully we'll have after this presentation, which I ask you to bear with me, because there's a lot of information on this topic, and I don't know if I've organized the share of it that I would like to present in the most coherent fashion. So if you could bear with me, that would be wonderful of you. And hopefully we can clarify some things during discussion session. So to start, first of all, I think it's very, very, very important that we discuss this and similar issues. In other words, issues that are defining issues of our day. The events that are happening in Iraq, the events that precipitated those events, and events that will arise from the situation there will have an impact on the destiny of this country into the very distant future, will have an impact on the destiny of the Middle East into the very distant future, and will have an impact on the destiny of humanity excuse me, into the distant future. Now, the topic that I have, even before that, the reason it's important to discuss these events, especially in a critical light, is because increasingly criticism in this country, especially, and in other countries, is being stifled, is being discouraged. Even those of you who are listening to the confirmation hearings for Condoleezza Rice as the new Secretary of State, you will recall, or actually in the open Senate discussion, one of the senators warning his counterparts not to be overly critical of Ms. Rice because they would jeopardize her standing and image to the people she will subsequently be working with, or the leaders of other countries. Now, that's really strange that we will have a warning not to point out someone's mendacity. That's a nice way to say lying. a warning against pointing out someone's lies and contradictions, but not a warning to public officials not to lie. So the onus falls upon the people. See, we shouldn't criticize. We should just be quiet and accept the lies, accept the hypocrisy, and accept the double standards, accept the cover-ups, and anything else that's thrown our way, and just be quiet. Don't say anything. And if we speak out, then we're the troublemakers, not the ones who told the lies, not the ones who initiated the hypocritical policies, not the ones who are engaging in out-and-out genocide in many instances or turning a blind eye to the same, but the people who would dare to question it. So when you have such an environment, it is incumbent upon the people to freely and critically look at what's going on. And yes, it can be quite dangerous. It can be bad for your health. And that's nothing new. Our Prophet ﷺ, those of us who are Muslim, he said, amongst other things, أفضل جهاد كلمة حق عند سلطان جائر. The best jihad is a word of truth in the face of a tyrannical ruler. And the reason for that is made clear in a related hadith when he said, أفضل الشهداء, the best of all martyrs, Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, ورجل قال كلمة حق عند سلطان جائر أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. So the reason that it's the best jihad is made clear, as we said. Another tradition where he says the best of martyrs are Hamza, the son of Abdul Muttalib, his uncle, may God be pleased with him, and a person who speaks a word of truth in the face of an oppressive ruler, because oftentimes that will lead to your death or your imprisonment. So you will be, like Hamza, a martyr in many instances. So it is sometimes dangerous to speak out, but it is incumbent upon people of goodwill and people of faith especially to do so. The title of this talk, Iraq, America's New Vietnam, this title was chosen because, amongst other things, we here in America, we're in the habit of saying that Afghanistan, for example, was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. In other words, a situation that would prove so messy, so difficult to extricate itself from, that it would eventually lead to a severe weakening. And as actually happened, the actual collapse, amongst other factors, but certainly a major precipitating factor, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Vietnam, just as Vietnam, didn't lead to a collapse of the United States, but it certainly led to a quagmire, a situation where our military forces became bogged down in a struggle that they could not win. Quite frankly. And a struggle which didn't lead to the collapse of the United States, but certainly led to a restructuring of this country politically and economically. It was the economic burden of trying to finance the Great Society here at home and simultaneously finance the Vietnam War that led to the permanent demise of the gold standard in 1972, and that precipitated the beginning of the astronomical debt, our budget deficits rather, in this country, that led to a dangerous, unprecedented situation, unprecedented in the history of capitalism anyway, of stagflation, the simultaneous occurrence of economic stagnation and high rates of inflation. So all of these economic maladies emerged from the Vietnam War, and they led to a restructuring of the economy of this country. And as a result, literally in economic terms, we're living as a country on borrowed time, no pun intended. Because if foreign nations, not having a gold standard, lose their confidence in the dollar, well, they probably already have gained the courage to act on their lost confidence in the dollar, and then begin to go over here. Oh, you're looking at me and going like that. Act on their loss of confidence and start paying for oil with euros, as is being contemplated, or stop buying U.S. Treasury bonds, the principal means of financing that deficit, bridging those budget deficits. This country would be in a severe, severe, severe economic crisis of unfathomable implications. So all of that arises directly from the Vietnam War. So Vietnam was really our Vietnam. Or to be more savvy, Vietnam was our Afghanistan. And now we have another Vietnam in Iraq. So we want to look at the parallels and some differences between the two situations, and ultimately look at the conclusion that I see happening to justify the selection of this title. So if we start with the parallels, Vietnam, the war in Vietnam and American involvement in Vietnam didn't start when American troops entered Vietnam en masse. So America's involvement in Vietnam didn't start in the early 1960s during the Kennedy administration. It started well before that. It started in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, when the French tried to bring the Vietnamese back into their colonial orbit. And a long and bloody war, culminating with the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1953, which was followed soon thereafter by the ouster of the French. A large portion of the French war effort was financed by the United States. So that was really the beginning, and the conflict, the French involvement in Vietnam was an aspect of American foreign policy that was tolerated and encouraged, and as I said, financed. So those were the real beginnings of America's involvement in Vietnam in a substantial way. Now, Iraq, as we know, American involvement in Iraq didn't begin in March of 2003. It began even before the coming of Saddam Hussein to power. And we could say that our country was intricately involved in Saddam Hussein's coming to power. Our country was involved with encouraging Saddam Hussein and then turning a blind eye while Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq. And this is another thing that struck me at the Rice hearings, and we could talk about Gonzalez also, touch every base, but I listened to those, I didn't listen to the Gonzalez hearings because of preoccupations, but I had a chance to listen to a lot of the Rice hearings. And one thing she said, which again is part of the slick propaganda techniques being used by the current administration, and certainly by every administration, but I think these guys and gals have taken it to a new level. In any case, she said that when challenged by Barbara Boxer about some of her contradictory stands, well, it wasn't just the weapons of massive destruction. Saddam Hussein was a tyrant and a dictator, and he used weapons of mass destruction against his own people. And my jaws are dropping, because everything that she's saying, of course it's true, but who is he doing that for? On whose behalf? And who turned a blind eye to it all? Who turned a blind eye to it all? Who turned a blind eye when he was using Scuds indiscriminately against Iranian civilian populations in Khuzestan province, in Dezful, and Suzangard, Ahwaz, Kharamshar, Abadan, and literally reducing many of these cities to rubble, wiping one town, the town of Huwaiza, a town of 72,000 people, wiping it off the face of the earth, leaving one building standing, which was the Iraqi command post. Literally bulldozed, wiped, erased off the face of the earth. And tens of other towns and villages. He was our bad guy, so we turned a blind eye and didn't say or do anything. Yes, he used weapons of mass destruction. He used chemical nerve gas and mustard gas against waves of Iranian troops, primarily volunteers. He used it against the Kurds, who said and did nothing at the time. American administration. And many of the same guys, you've all seen the picture of Rumsfeld in Baghdad happily shaking hands with his buddy Saddam. Those were the same guys patting Saddam on the back for containing the threat of radical fundamentalism. Good job, Saddam. Same guys turning a blind eye, no efforts at UN resolutions, no efforts at sanctions, no efforts at bombing his plants, because then we'd be bombing our own investments, because we built those plants to make the chemical weapons along with the British and French. So to turn around and say, oh, and he used weapons of mass destruction against, it just shows the blatant hypocrisy of this gang. In any case, so Vietnam started before our involvement started, long before the troops went in, and the same for this current war in Iraq. So our involvement was there before the Iran-Iraq war, throughout the Iran-Iraq war, in which the Iraqi people suffered tremendously doing our dirty work. It was there during the 1990-91 Desert Shield, Desert Storm operations, which were tremendously brutal operations, not directly against, primarily against hapless Iraqi soldiers, who many were thrown out into the desert to be bulldozed and buried to death, indiscriminately bombed with every sort of ordnance, but also against the Iraqi civilians, whose entire civilian infrastructure was systematically destroyed. Sewage treatment plants, electrical generating plants, and pesticide, fertilizer installations, pesticide plants with no chemical weapon dual-use capability, indiscriminately bombed, leading to 12 years of hell. The sanctions subsequently applied to prevent much of that from being effectively rebuilt. So children dying because they're forced to drink. Everyone's forced, but the weakest are the most severely affected. The children and the elderly, the sick and the infirm. to drink sewage-contaminated water, all sorts of diseases that have been eradicated, such as hoof and mouth disease, returning and devastating Iraqi livestock herds and flocks. So, and we know the 500,000 children, 500,000 children that Madeleine Albright admitted to murdering, and subsequently for no reason in Iraq, and then throughout the sanctions, and then the war, the subsequent war in 2003. So throughout this period, there's been American involvement. From the end of the official end of the first war in 91 until the beginning of the new war, American and British planes flew over 100,000 operation sorties against Iraqi targets, destroying whatever hadn't been destroyed during the war itself. Over 100,000 sorties were flown during the period of sanctions against Iraqi targets. So, and we'll come back to this issue momentarily. The second thing to point out, similarities. So, involvement preceded the actual hostilities, relevant hostilities. The second point is that there was, in both cases, there was never a formal declaration of war. There was no formal declaration of war against Iraq this time, and there was no formal declaration of war against the Vietnamese. And these are historical facts. To a large extent, both wars were resource wars. And in Vietnam, this isn't discussed much. But it's a fact. One of the main reasons motivating our involvement wasn't a domino theory and all of that other stuff. It was to preserve our access to one of the most critical metals that are used in high-tech military application, and that is tungsten. Vietnam, in addition to China, is one of the major producers of tungsten. And we did not want the majority of the world's tungsten supply to be controlled by the communists, because that metal is especially critical in the construction of supersonic aircrafts. Extremely light and extremely strong metal. So that was one of our principal unstated motivations for going to war in Vietnam. Iraq is also, to a large extent, I wouldn't say exclusively, a resource war, in the sense that Iraq controls or lies over at least 11% of the world's known petroleum reserves, an even larger percentage of natural gas preserves, and is part of the Central Asian region that in the future, during an era where we are past what's being called peak oil. In other words, oil is a finite resource. There's only so much oil in the ground, as one singing group used to say. Who was it? Brother Rashid. There's only so much oil in the earth. Anybody? The Tower of Power. Come on, folks. So, did I hit that? Okay. That's for the visual presentation. In any case, there's only so much oil in the ground. And we have entered into a period, by best estimates, and these are estimates, where the amount that remains is less than the amount that has already been extracted. Which means from here out, it will become increasingly expensive to extract additional reserves from the ground. Now, the Middle East becomes increasingly important for a number of reasons. Number one, collectively, the Middle East and the Central Asian regions, all of which are predominantly Muslim countries, contain a disproportionately high percentage of known reserves, number one. Number two, this region, particularly the Middle East countries, are the only regions that are not producing at close to full capacity. In other words, the ability to expand the production of oil, generally speaking, only exists in that region above current production capacities. Nigeria, Venezuela, Canada, Russia, all of these areas that are major oil exporters are producing at near capacity. Only in the Middle East is there the potential to expand production capacity significantly. The third reason that the oil there is of particular interest is that that area, as a region, the Middle East is the only area which has not reached peak production capacity. In other words, it is in this area where there is more oil remaining than has already been produced from known oil fields. So as the demand for energy rises, and some of you have heard Michael Rupert talk about oil civilization, where oil is critical for every aspect of our lives. We might think, well, I don't drive a car. I live in New York. I take the subway. What does that run on? It doesn't run on oil. It runs on electricity. What's burned to generate the electricity? Oil. The clothes most of us wear, polyester, nylon, what's it made out of? Oil. Even if we're health conscious and we drink our water we drink water from Poland Springs in Maine, what's the container made out of? Oil. The roads that bring the water down from Poland Springs, most of them are made from asphalt, which in turn is made from oil. The tires increasingly are made from synthetic fibers, oil. So the rubber that's meeting the oil-based road is being met by the oil-based rubber. The plastic in the wire, oil. The plastic in the recorder, oil. The plastic in the lenses of the eyeglasses, oil. The plastic in your headphones, oil. The food that we eat, the fertilizers increasingly are oil-based fertilizers and pesticides. It's all oil. The energy to fuel it all, oil, with no viable alternatives on the horizon. So now, as we move into a period where domestic consumption continues to increase, domestic meaning here in the United States, and as other societies, particularly the three that are particularly worrisome, China, yes, India, and Indonesia. As those countries continue to modernize, especially China, there's a demand for automobiles, there's a demand for the Western way of life. May God spare those societies. I mean, the insanity, somebody should hold on to their indigenous way of life. That's why a lot of people don't like Muslims, because Muslims are holding on to a large extent, I mean, in many ways, and especially in indigenous Muslim societies. And that's problematic, because just simple things like drinking tea are problematic when you're Coke and Pepsi and you're trying to expand your global sales. We don't want people drinking tea. That's problematic. We have to get them to drink Coke or Pepsi so that we can tap into that, what is calling, they have a name for it, and it's being discussed right now at the World Economic Summit in Switzerland, how we can tap the economic potential of the underclass, the people who barely have money. How, in other words, and if you look, I've done it, if you go on their website and you look at the various forums, this particular forum is how can we make this Western lifestyle affordable to those people who currently can't afford it, so that we can take their money, the little bit they have also. That's being discussed. In any case, I think I'm going off on a tangent. So I'm going to come back. Well, not really, because we're talking about oil and a resource. Now, why is that important? As the demand for oil in China and India and Indonesia rises, if they control the oil resources that are in their potential spheres of influence, that would deny those resources to the United States. If those resources are denied to the United States, economic growth here will be problematic. So whoever controls that Central Asian basin will control the world economically. And that's geopolitics. We had previously in the era of sea power, whoever controlled the critical choke points, Mackinder, I believe, his theory, would control the world. So the British set out to control the Straits of Gibraltar, the Dardanelles, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Malacca, and a few others, in order to control the world economically. Now, in the age of oil civilization, whoever controls that Central Asian basin controls the world. And if you want to read about this, I refer you to Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard, 1997, and which he laid out a blueprint for American empire to control that region. And there was only one thing which he noted, and that was also noted in the architects who drafted up the project for the new American century. There was only one thing that was needed to get the American people to go along with the project of empire, and that was a catastrophic event on the scale of Pearl Harbor. It's there in his book on, I think, page 24. Lo and behold. So those are two similarities. They were both, to a large extent, resource wars. Our involvement in Iraq being to control the oil, amongst other things. I'm not saying exclusively, so don't try to get me on that one. But a big part of it. And also to secure that Central Asian basis. If you control Iraq, you control Iran and Syria, two potential dissenting states to the program. The $100 billion being demanded by Congress, what's most of that earmarked for? To construct 5 permanent military bases in Iraq. So there's a lot afoot. Another similarity, the events that were used to justify our intervention in both cases were lies. In Vietnam, what was the big lie to start that off? Full-scale American involvement? The Gulf of Tonkin attack of the second attack of August 4th, 1964, and the subsequent Gulf of Tonkin resolution of August 7th, 1964. Those attacks of August 4th never happened. And to show how cynical the leaders who will come and tell those lies are, a year later, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson, who gave that speech on August 4th to inform the American public in retaliation to those attacks that never took place, we have commenced bombing targets in North Vietnam. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? A year later, he in the public record, said that there were no Vietnamese PT boats out there. We might as well have been shooting at whales. We might as well have been shooting at whales. A year later. So our intervention was predicated on a lie. And we know this time around, our intervention in Iraq was predicated on a series of lies. The big lie being the weapons of mass destruction lie. And those events, and you're well familiar with. To make it all the more loathsome is that the whole campaign was orchestrated by an advertisement firm. Those lies were part of our introducing a new product into the market. And you don't introduce new products in August, which the administration wanted to do. When do you introduce the new cars and the new television programs? In September. And that's when we introduced the new product. Only this new product has and will continue to result in a lot of innocent lives being lost and other damage. So both of these involvements started on the basis of a lie. And unfortunately, Johnson was taken to task, but no one in the current administration has been. Now, those lies in both instances, what made the public so gullible for those lies? Both of the lies took place in a climate of fear. The initial time around, the fear of communism and the spread of communism. I had a quote here from Johnson, if I could find it. He made in Honolulu shortly after. It's worth mentioning, so I'll take a brief. Let's see if I can grab it right quick. If not. So this is LBJ, Honolulu, February 6, 1966. Now there are two things here of relevance. He says, if we allow the communists to win in Vietnam, it will become easier and more appetizing for them to take over other countries and other parts of the world. We will have to fight again in some other place or in some place else. At what cost? No one knows. That is why it is vitally important to every American family, that we stop the communists in South Vietnam. Now this was at the height of the Red Scare, duck and cover. Remember the turtle? Duck and cover. Some of you are old enough, and the turtle goes in his shell. The ballistic missile attack drills and the fallout shelters, the yellow signs, and brother nodding his head because used to go steal them army rations too. Get those dried up army crackers. They're pretty good in soup from the fallout shelters. So in that climate, we introduced the scare in Vietnam, and we introduced the lie, and the lie is bought. And here, the climate, the post-September 11th climate of fear that has been exploited to the max by our politicians to make everyone think that even little old ladies in the middle of the boondocks in Connecticut or in Biloxi, Mississippi, putting duct tape and plastic on their windows because Al-Qaeda can get them. Now how Al-Qaeda or any Al-Qaeda operative will find his way to that little old lady's farm in Tupelo, Mississippi, I don't know. He could ask someone, how did I get to Tupelo? He said, just go to Wampelo and turn right. Shukran ya Habib. But that's how deep the fear has been exploited in this country. And the whole September 11th thing and what happened here in New York and the, if you look at, like they say, you can't discuss it critically because you're a conspiracy theorist, right? So all the Muslims shut up. But the government is advancing a conspiracy, right? That Bin Laden in his cave with his cell phone and his networks with being monitored by $40 billion of intelligence, with his network of operatives, did what? Conspired to bring down the towers and attack the Pentagon, right? That's a conspiracy theory. So it's not a question of conspiracy theory, it's the question of which conspiracy theory is more viable. And the viability of the government's theory is borne out by the fact that there hasn't been a single successful prosecution from that whole case. Nowhere on the face of the earth. Now it goes downhill from there, but that's another talk. I'll refer you to 3 books. The duty of every responsible citizen in this country to read, because these are events that are shaping the life of this planet. And we should be informed about what really happened. 3 books. 1, Mike Rupert, Crossing the Rubicon. Crossing the Rubicon. Book number 1. Book number 2, 2 and 3 are by the same author. David R. Griffin. The New Pearl Harbor and the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Lies. I think that's the name. Let me double check. And distortions, yes. Okay. Yes. Omissions and distortions. Distortions is a euphemism for lies. It's the duty of every American citizen to read these books at least. And Griffin summarizes the work of a lot of other, they both do, exhaustively. And you look at these events in a different light. But again, that's not the topic we're discussing tonight. But the point is, those events have been exploited to create a climate of fear that makes the public gullible for lies from low places or high places, depending on how you look at it. Just as in Vietnam, the climate of the Red Scare and the Communist menace created the environment that made the public gullible for the lies that were told to get us deeper, ever more deeper involved in Vietnam. Both cases, the actual pretext for going to war, the weapons of mass destruction, the war on terrorism, The first instance, the Gulf of Tonkin attacks, were pretext to implement pre-existing plans. The plan for American intervention in Southeast Asia was drawn up long before the Gulf of Tonkin. Just as the plan, as we all know, to intervene in Iraq militarily was drawn up long before the aluminum tubes or the transaction with Niger to purchase uranium or any of these other events took place. Those plans were drawn up long, long, long before. And innocent people and innocent Americans have suffered as a consequence. Now, another similarity that we can point out is in both instances, in implementing those pre-existing plans, part of a pre-existing agenda, total disregard for human life was demonstrated. For American life, Vietnamese life, Iraqi life was demonstrated. And in each instance, there's a signal issue that epitomizes that disregard for innocent life. In the case of Vietnam, it was the widespread and indiscriminate use of Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant that caused the leaves to fall off trees, therefore denying the enemy a place to hide, because there were sneaky devils, or gooks, not devils, who would ambush our innocent troops from trees and in the jungle. So we proceeded to defoliate an area approximately the size of the state of Vermont collectively. Those chemicals contained deadly dioxins, and it wasn't just Agent Orange, it was Agent Orange, Agent White, and Agent Blue. Those chemicals were never adequately tested, were indiscriminately used, and brought major health defects and early deaths to American soldiers and untold hundreds of thousands, possibly Vietnamese. If you go to the website of the Veterans Administration, they'll give you a list of diseases that are linked in veterans to Agent Orange. And I'll read you some of them. Those I know. Anyone studying here at the medical school, you can correct my pronunciation. Diabetes, mellitus, spina bifida, Hodgkin's disease, multiple myeloma, lymphoma, couple I can't even endeavor to pronounce, peripheral, acute and subacute peripheral neuropathy, porphyria, prostate cancer, respiratory cancers, soft tissue sarcoma, and others. And I refer you to the VA website. Just do a Google search, Agent Orange, and you'll get not only the VA, a lot of other websites. Now, the veterans have gotten some token relief from the makers of the drugs, who settled out of court for $180 million, which is token because the damage far exceeds that. The Vietnamese people, whose lands and waters were poisoned by non-biodegradable toxins for who knows how long into the future, the birth defects and that's something else I didn't. The settlement also included major birth defects that afflicted the children of veterans. Vietnamese people have gotten no relief. Their suits, the lawsuit of the Vietnamese people against the makers of Agent Orange and the United States government is still in court. And you know how long ago the Vietnam War ended. So like the victims of the Bhopal disaster in India, they've gotten no relief. And like the victims of future ecological disasters in Iraq, they will receive no relief. Because one of the things in Iraq that disregards any transfer of sovereignty, the outcome of no elections, number one, every contract that has been signed by an American contractor is valid for 40 years. And one of the conditions to transfer sovereignty to Alawi, who we'll talk about in a minute, was that he accepts that as a condition to transfer sovereignty. Now, what kind of sovereignty is that? Where foreign companies have a guaranteed 40-year contract regardless of the government. That's an issue that we can examine. Political scientists. What brand of sovereignty is that? Another condition, every Iraqi ministry will be overseen by an American overseer. No contract can be signed. No hiring decisions can be made in any Iraqi ministries without the coordination of that overseer. Again, what kind of sovereignty is that? Halliburton, or American oil companies in general, are immune from any criminal or malpractice lawsuits that emanate from the handling, shipment, processing of Iraqi oil. Immune, totally immune. So if there's a major oil spill and the Tigris or Euphrates rivers fill up with oil, they're immune from any criminal prosecution. If there's an oil fire, an explosion, and Iraqi workers are killed, their families cannot sue the oil companies for any compensation as things now stand. So, Vietnam, it was Agent Orange, Agent White, Agent Blue, most prominently Agent Orange. In Iraq, it is depleted uranium. Now, those aren't the only issues that have a tremendously disadvantageous effect on human life. As we said, those epitomize the general disregard for human life. Depleted uranium used primarily against troop positions during the first Gulf War, the 1991 war, which was Gulf War II. That was the second one. The Iran-Iraq war was Gulf War I. So now we have Gulf War III. So during the 90-91 war, and in the cities against the various installations, depleted uranium is a way to recycle radioactive waste that used to be buried in concrete lead cases and dropped in the middle of the ocean or buried in the desert. They found an ingenious way to make money from it and also to make weaponry, especially armor-piercing projectiles and concrete-piercing projectiles, more effective by packing it onto the warheads of those projectiles, and even cannon rounds. And tens of thousands of tons have been used even more so this time, and even more in the city. The shock and awe, all those flares shooting from the ground, all of that was from uranium vaporizing. A lot of those color effects. So what does depleted uranium do? When a round pierces concrete or armor on a tank, it slices through it. The uranium on the warhead vaporizes on contact and melts the metal or the concrete, and the projectile goes through it like a knife through butter. That vapor then goes into the air. Anyone in the immediate vicinity is breathing radioactive, vaporized radioactive waste. Or even more dangerously, it goes into the sand. The sand is then blown around in the sandstorms that are very frequent in the region, or it goes into the water, which is subsequently ingested by animals or humans, and it alters the genetic makeup of the human beings, leading to major illnesses and cancers, and in the unborn, unimaginable, and in Iraq, formerly unknown birth defects, and in American soldiers. As we said, that disregard for life is not only the Iraqi people, it's those Americans, many of whom joined the military because they couldn't afford to come to Columbia. They wanted an education also. That's why I joined. My introduction said Air Force veteran, 4.5 years. I joined to get the educational benefits, which I subsequently used. And that's why a lot of people joined. It's called the poverty draft, who are sent there to breathe the depleted uranium, sent there to deal with the nightmarish scenario. Some of you might have heard the story. How many of you heard Seymour Hersh's lecture on Abu Ghraib? So some of you have. You recall him talking about a lady somewhere, I think in Virginia or West Virginia, whose daughter was at Abu Ghraib. She went there, she was married, she was normal. She came back, she left her husband, she left her job, she moved out of the house, and she began. So in the meantime, her mother got her laptop computer and found pictures of far more horrific things. We saw a picture of the naked man with the dogs about to sick him. She had in her computer pictures of the bloodied man after the dogs had ripped into him. This girl, her mother said every weekend after she got out from work, she would go to a tattoo parlor and get a black tattoo, and her body slowly became covered with black tattoos. And she won't talk to anyone now. These kids are being screwed up. And if you want a commonality, just as a generation of Viet Nam veterans, many of whom were screwed up, and came back, if they didn't come back in a box that was also probably stuffed with heroin to hit our streets. Mike Rupert, his start in investigative reporting started with that story. The CIA bringing drugs into Los Angeles and setting up the Bloods and the Crips to go at each other in these turf wars. Well, that was cocaine. That was a little later. That's another story. If you get a book called Into the Buzzsaw, and the buzzsaw is how the corporate media tears up anyone who tries to get a meaningful story introduced into public discourse. And the gentleman who wrote that story for the San Jose Mercury News, his career was ruined because of that story. He documented the cocaine, how it was brought into San Francisco and then sent to LA and to the Bloods and Crips, and how weapons were sent in to create this urban hell that we're still living with the effects of. And he documented it. As a result of that, though, his career was ruined, as many other people. The largest missionary group in America, Wycliffe, there's another story in that book that they never wanted you to read, was intricately involved in a scheme being financed by the Rockefellers here in New York to get the Indians in Central America and in the Amazon rainforest off of their land so that land could be bought up by the Rockefellers and then sold for profit, along with everything on it. So in any case, we're going off on another tangent. So depleted uranium epitomizes, now far more has been used this time around, and much of it in the cities in Baghdad, in Najaf, and Fallujah, which has been largely razed and made uninhabitable. So those are some more similarities. And it's already happening. Most of the homeless people, males, in this country are Vietnam veterans. You can trace the demise of the family structure in the African American community to the Vietnam War. Before the Vietnam War in 1960, 80% of all African American homes were male-headed. After Vietnam, we had a generation who, as we said, either came back in a coffin or came back psychologically or psychiatrically impaired, or came back as an alcoholic or a drug addict. After Vietnam, shortly after, 60% and currently 80% of homes in African American community are female-headed. That's one of the byproducts of Vietnam. And that same social devastation, if this war in Iraq endures, is going to afflict this current generation with untold consequences for the future. And the same people that are saying support the troops, and most of them never supported any war with their physical presence, and I say that as a veteran. They call them chicken hawks, right? Support the troops. They're the same ones that are slashing any benefits for those troops, or slashing benefits for those troops. They're the same ones that are extending the enlistment of reservists and National Guards people, tearing up communities. They're the same ones that are finding it problematic to give full benefit packages even to wounded National Guardsmen or reservists, because they're not full-time troops. And they're the same ones. This is something you should be cognizant of. Many people are asking, how could, number one, how could a Muslim be so stupid to behead someone at the height of the Abu Ghraib scandal? Have a lot of you asked that question? No? Nick Berg, when was his head cut off? Right at the height of the Abu Ghraib scandal. What did it do? It knocked Abu Ghraib out of the news. Because Rush Limbaugh and Mike Savage and the rest of the gang, you see, what we're doing at Abu Ghraib is nothing, just having some people undressed. These barbarians are cutting heads off our innocent civilians. And people, yeah, they're barbed. They deserve anything we do to them. And that's the end of the story. So maybe you didn't ask, I asked, and these guys are supposed to be Muslims. I asked myself, how could Muslims be so stupid? Was another incident that made you ask, how could a Muslim be so stupid? The kidnappers of Margaret Hassan, who's a Muslim, when did they decide to blow her brains out? Huh? The very day an American cameraman captures a U.S. Marine in a mosque blowing the brains out of an old Iraqi man with his hands tied up. The same day. And the next day, lo and behold, in the San Francisco Bay Area, headline number one, the Oakland Tribune had the Marine story. The San Francisco Chronicle, the largest and most influential paper in the region, had on the front page the Margaret Hassan story. Now, if you didn't ask, how could a Muslim be so stupid to do that at that time, which was a PR disaster globally for the American military? So if you're fighting them, why would you put something that would allow that story to be knocked right out of the news? Or Margaret Hassan was a Muslim who was fluent in Arabic, loved by the Iraqis that she interacted with, primarily working for children who are affected by the sanctions. And the infamous Zarqawi, whoever that is, says, and that's another Condoleezza Riceism. During her confirmation hearings, she said, and also Iraq has become a haven, after what happened? For terrorists such as Zarqawi, who's become the very face of terrorism. What happened to bin Laden? I thought he was supposed to be the very face of terrorism. Does the very face of terrorism change to suit our national interest? Anyway, let me leave Condoleezza alone. She has enough problems of her own. But Zarqawi group says, we didn't kidnap Margaret Hassan, and if they turn over to us, we're going to release her. Now, who would be dastardly enough as a Muslim to blow this lady's brains out, who spent her whole life working for Iraqi children, who converted to Islam, who was fluent in Arabic? Well, I refer you to a story in Mother Jones. Last month, the Iraq veteran on the cover, Hell No, We Won't Go. That issue. It might be the month before. In there, there's a story documenting how American contractors, such as Blackwater, these private contractors, have hired over 20,000 Serbian paramilitaries who are the people killing and cutting the stomachs of pregnant and raping Muslim women in Bosnia, hiring former South African hitmen who, amongst other things, were tracking down and murdering opponents of apartheid, hardcore racists, hiring them with no background checks and turning them loose in Iraq. Now, don't you think it's highly possible that some of these convicted, they've been indicted, some of these people, for crimes against humanity, could do some of those things? I do. I don't know about you. Which is, again, a similarity between these two conflicts, and again, indiscriminate killing. Now, in both instances, there's talk of expanding the war to end the war. So in Vietnam, we have to expand into Laos and Cambodia because the enemy is taking cover there. They're moving supplies through those areas, right? So we expanded the war, and it was a disaster. And now there's talk of expanding the war somehow to Iran. Were that to happen, that would be the worst foreign policy decision this country ever made. Ever. Because what it would do, first of all, it would mobilize the previously non-committed Shi'i militias who are far stronger than the Sunni militias. Primarily the militia of Ayatollah Hakim, who stands to be the big winner in the voting that's supposed to take place tomorrow. And the militia of As-Sadr, who's wavering anyway in terms of his support for this voting process. So that would be a disaster. And there are other implications that we won't go into right now. It would be an unmitigated disaster, just as the decision of the United States to begin military operations and bombing in Laos and Cambodia led to an unmitigated disaster and precipitated the events that led to an American withdrawal in defeat from Indochina. Now, moving towards a conclusion, another similarity, and this is quite obvious, the dehumanization of the enemy. In Vietnam, the enemy is totally dehumanized, referred to by all sorts of derogatory names, mentioned gooks and slants, slant eyes, Orientals. And even McNamara, I don't know if they put this in the fog of war, I didn't see it, but I've seen another documentary where he says, you know, these people just don't value life like we do. So in other words, so he kill a couple 100,000 of them, you know, they'll get over it. They don't value life like we do. Then in this document, they show Vietnam mothers just screaming because their children have been murdered by bombs. You know, they don't value life like we do. We all human and we all bleed the same. In this case, the most dehumanizing term has been terrorist. Right? Anyone who opposes the war is a terrorist. There are some legitimate terrorists, but they're not the majority. And Mao Zedong said a gorilla is a fish that swims in the sea of the people. And if there's no popular discontent, in Vietnam, for example, there wouldn't have been a viable opposition. And if there were no popular discontent in Iraq, there would be no viable opposition. So the fact is there is widespread popular discontent. I'll read you a very insightful quote. I should have prepared that and had all this stuff over here. Very nice quote from this book, The Freedom, Shadows and Hallucinations in Occupied Iraq. And this is an average Iraqi, but he captures the spirit of discontent with what's happened to his country. This is from a young man by the name of Akil, 26 years old, on life in the new Iraq. He says, the freedom. Look, we have the gaslighting freedom, the looting freedom, the killing freedom, the rape freedom, the hash smoking freedom. I don't know what to do with all this freedom. So it's not the people who have killed between the 1991 war, between the sanctions and the 100,000 sorties between the implementation of sanctions and the 2002 war. The 2002 war onwards, which independent sources have informed us have resulted in over 100,000 Iraqi deaths. Collectively, we're looking at upwards to 3 million people killed, which are similar to Vietnam. That's the number that were killed in Vietnam. A war we fought with one hand tied behind our back. Ever heard that? So if we use two hands, 6, 7, 8 million dead, that would have showed them really what America can do. It's a shame It's a shame when one of the few things we can say that our country leads the world in is the efficacy of our ability to kill people. Education, way down. Social services for industrialized nations, way down on the list. Percentage of GNP for foreign aid, way down on the list. Military spending, we spend almost more now on our military than the rest of the world combined. This year, $500 billion. $500 billion. You know how much the axis of evil spent this year? $5 billion. But that's a credible threat, which is a whole nother issue. Someone should sponsor a lecture called The Fake Islamic Threat. They attack the towers. How can you say it's a fake threat? They're probably Islamic fundamentalists discovering the Beatles. I get by with a little help from my friends. So in both cases, dehumanization. Now, in conclusion, Vietnam led to defeat for two primary reasons. Usually we focus on one, the massive opposition to the war here and people going out into the streets. But there was another reason that was more important. That was important. It was the moneyed elite seeing the possibilities of a financial disaster. That's what led to the Vietnam War ending. Now, the popular resistance was important, no doubt, and probably was a catalyst that accelerated the process. This war in Iraq will end for the same two reasons. Popular opposition, as more and more body bags come home, as more and more wounded come home, severely wounded, as people began to understand that they've been had, as Malcolm said, you've been had, you've been bamboozled, a couple others. When people wake up to those realities, they're going to be mad. And that's going to accelerate the process of withdrawal. But ultimately, it will be the understanding of the moneyed elites of this country that continued involvement will precipitate a financial disaster for this country that will lead to the withdrawal of American troops from Iraq in defeat, not having accomplished their objectives. So we ask Allah for well-being for everyone, for this country, for Iraq, the people of the world. We ask, if someone says, what can we do? First, number one, hold on to your humanity. Because the schemes that are unfolding, that require the complicity and the blind, uncritical allegiance of the public in this country are predicated on our surrendering our humanity and the higher human values that define us. The values of decency and courage, the values of fairness and justice, the values of honesty. It's only when we surrender those that we're prone to the type of manipulation that gets us to accept all of these things that are unfolding as palatable, acceptable policies and stands towards various issues. So we have to collectively hold on to our humanity. As Muslims, that should be easy. Stay in touch with the Quran. Stay in touch with the meanings and messages of the Quran. Hold on to the Sunnah. Don't be one of those Muslims who say, oh, we don't need the Sunnah, because the Sunnah it's oppressive. So we need a liberational Islam, a progressive Islam. We need the Islam that has sustained this ummah during very dark days and allowed it to come out of those crises, the Crusades, the Mongol invasions, far darker days than the days we're in now, with the individual Muslim's dignity and humanity intact. That's the Islam we need. We need an Islam that says your liberation doesn't lie in a liberal liberation that frees you from any restraints or constraints, that oppresses you or represses your innate urges. What kind of Islam is that? That's not the Islam of the Quran. The Islam of the Quran says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ. The one who fears his Lord, old-time religion, fear of God. Not a new time religion that says our religion should have no fear or intimidation in it. No, human beings shouldn't intimidate each other, but we should feel intimidated if we transgress against the orders and ordainments of God. وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ. The one who fears the station of his or her Lord. وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ. And denies his soul those things it inclines for. All right? The postmodern Islam tells us, because it's consistent with postmodern thought, you know, don't suppress yourself. Starting in the 60s, right? Let it all hang out. Even as a Muslim, if you're inclined, express yourself. You have homosexual urges, express yourself. You have pedophilia urges, express yourself. That's where your fulfillment lies. You have urges for your neighbor's wife or husband. Wait till the other spouse goes on a trip somewhere and express yourself. Act on those urges. That's what the postmodern condition's telling us. That's not what Islam historically has told us. And those things are real. They're real. But it's told us for our collective sanity and our collective ability to survive, sometimes we have to suppress the urges of our soul, and that's the key to our liberation. Enslavement to God is the key to our liberation in this earth. Allahu a'lam wal musta'an. God knows best, and His help is sought in all things. We have to network. We'll differ on many things. Muslims, non-Muslims, leftists, rightists, and there's a growing right-wing dissatisfaction with what's going on in this country. We'll disagree on a lot of things, but we have to find common issues we agree on that are mutually beneficial to all of us and come together on those things. And the power of the people to do that is illustrated in the tsunami relief effort. Now, whether that money will reach the people it's designated for or not is another issue. The point is, more money was raised from private individuals of all backgrounds, all stripes, all religions, than was donated by governments and private corporations. And that power to come together, not just nationally, transnationally, to address major international issues, that's where we need to go. And if we want to liberate ourselves from anything, we have to liberate ourselves from the enslavement to the nation state. The nation state is a largely anachronistic organization that's only exploited in these days and times by elites selectively. So when the power of the nation state can be exploited for me to invade a country or subvert a potential rival, the nation state is good. But when the nation state is going to cut into my profits, the nation state is bad, and I'm going to put my corporate headquarters offshore. I'm going to advocate for NAFTA. Forget this country, forget the American workers, forget the Mexican economy. One of the impacts of NAFTA has been the destruction of the Mexican agricultural system that's based on corn. Because now we can send corn from Iowa, all of that surplus that we used to burn, we can send it to Mexico to people to buy in the market. No tariffs, no protection. Make your tortillas and your whatever else real cheap. And the poor Mexican farmers, what do? Close up shop and cross the border into San Diego and LA. That's poetic justice. So the bigger issues, AIDS in Africa primarily, requires a collective global effort. And the nation state and the corporation have proved inadequate. So if we want to liberate ourselves, we have to liberate ourselves from our enslavement to the corporation that does not have our collective good at heart, and from the nation state. Now, I'm not advocating a violent overthrow of the nation state. This isn't communism. What I'm advocating is having a vision, a human vision, that transcends the confinements of the nation state. And if we can do those two things, in addition to holding on to our humanity, then we're on the path to brighter days.